Hello everyone, welcome to Open Line. Interesting show tonight. Tennessee is preparing to execute its second person in the last 2 months. Tonight we are talking about the death penalty. What are your opinions on the death penalty? We want to hear from you. We have as our guest tonight Amy Lawrence. She is with Tennessee conservatives concerned about the death penalty. So thank you for being here, Amy.
Thank you for having me.
Tennessee conservatives concerned about the death penalty. What is this organization?
So we're a group of political and social conservatives who question the alignment of the death penalty with conservative principles, and that's primarily with fiscal responsibility, pro-life policies, and limited government. And
you have had a journey yourself when it comes to your opinion on the death penalty, right?
I have, yeah. I used to think that these issues were always black and white, that people were always guilty, and the more I started looking into it, the more I found out about the innocent people who had been released from death rows, and also just about the cost of the death penalty in general.
And you've written this article, conservatives should oppose the death penalty. In it, you say, I think public opinion still supports the death penalty, and evil should be met strongly.
Right.
So I mean, again, when people say, and generally conservatives, I think throughout history have said the death penalty is what we need to be doing. What kind of made you change?
Yeah, so first let me say the trend is moving away from the death penalty. We have seen about 1/3 of all repeal bills are coming from Republican lawmakers throughout the country. So the trend is moving away, and I think it's because we've seen that it costs a lot more to execute an inmate. It's about there's a North Carolina study that showed it's about $2 million more than seeking life without parole.
$2 million more?
That's right.
For one inmate?
One inmate.
And what are the costs behind that? Because I think some people would find that hard to believe, but when you start adding up, you know, I guess the appeals, right? I mean, what are the costs that are behind $2 million?
So the appeals are expensive, but really it's the first trial where the expenses start to increase. You have multiple attorneys, and that's for the defense and prosecution. You have jury sequestration. You have more witnesses, more evidence that's being brought into it. I mean, we're talking about life or death, so you're trying to get all the resources possible, and this all happens in the original trial. And then there are the appeals after appeals. They're granted at least 3 constitutional appeals that they have to go through.
And are you concerned about the length of time? I mean, I think in this article you're saying, yes, evil should be met with evil, but what is happening in the United States is not necessarily the appropriate way to go about things. Is that right? It's taking so long.
Most certainly, yeah. It takes, I think in Tennessee, about 28 years before an inmate's ever executed, or before they die of natural causes. And that's 28 years that the victim's family members have to go through these appeals, that they have to relive this horrible event that happened at the very, 28 years ago. And it's just horrific for everyone involved.
Several legislatures have repealed the death penalty. Nebraska, that's a conservative state, it repealed the death penalty.
It did.
You do think that this is coming more from conservatives? Is that right?
About 1/3 of all repeal bills are Republican repeal bills.
And so what led it in Nebraska? What carried the day in a conservative state like Nebraska?
So it was actually Colby Koash, who was a Republican. Well, he's conservative. They don't have parties there. But he started, again, questioning whether this was conservative, whether it was limited government indeed, or whether it was really pro-life, or whether it was cost effective, or whether we could be doing something better with our resources, whether we could give those to law enforcement to prevent further crimes, or go after some unsolved crimes with that money.
In other words, spend that $2 million on law enforcement.
Yeah.
The $2 million is being spent on the appeals.
Right. $2 million on law enforcement, on mental health, on education, on investigations.
And so how? All right, so Tennessee's getting ready to execute Edmund Zagorski Thursday. Are you involved in some of the, I guess, in the push to try and prevent that, or kind of where have you been as we're moving on this particular execution set for Thursday night?
So I tend to focus more on the broader policy of the death penalty. You know, I think with Edmund Zagorski, there's no question of guilt here. He murdered 2 people 30 years ago, Jimmy Porter and John Dotson.
Right.
John Dale Dotson.
John Dale Dotson and Jimmy Porter. That's
and
right.
These were horrible crimes that happened that long ago. So, you know, we try to focus on the death penalty broadly, but we follow along with some of these cases as they do happen here in Tennessee. You know, this has been I think, 34-year case.
34 years, 3 decades he's been on death row.
Right.
And I think in this thing that you wrote, or I saw, the #1 cause of death on death row is not the electric chair or lethal injection, it's natural causes.
Yeah, I believe today I saw natural causes is the first leading cause of death, the second is suicide, and the third is actually executions.
Now, Zagorski's attorneys have filed a filing saying that it's a lottery. The death penalty is essentially a lottery. That over the past 40 years in Tennessee, 2,500 people have been convicted of first-degree murder. Of those 2,500, only 86 got the death penalty, and of those 86, only 6 or 7 have been executed. So what they say is it's just somewhat random in how this penalty is given out.
That's right. Yeah, so there's actually 86 sustained death penalty sentences. There have been close to 200 death sentences, half of which have been vacated. But yeah, those 86, it's only 7 that have actually gotten the death penalty, the execution. And so it is random. I mean, you think there have been at least 20 other double homicide cases that have not been death penalty cases, and there are multiple people on serving life without parole that have double and quadruple homicides.
And they mentioned there are 2 people serving life with parole that have murdered 6 people.
Right.
Life without parole, who've murdered 6 people. And so do you feel like, your position is gaining traction or not? Because I'll tell you, you go on Facebook and I don't know that there's a lot of support out there again for the death penalty. So do you feel like it's gaining traction, or what do you see?
Yes, I think a Gallup poll in 2017 showed that Republican support for the death penalty has dropped 10 percentage points. It's still high, but you do see this trend of moving away towards other alternatives like life without parole.
All right, let's go to Brian. Brian, hello. Go right ahead, Brian.
Oh yeah, I love your associate producer. He's a good guy.
Taylor is a good guy.
Yeah, he's a good guy. And I told him, how do you think Brian would fall down on this? And he goes, Brian, you're on a lot of different things. You're at different places. I would think you'd be against it. I go, you're right. You're smart. And I go, why do you think that would be? He goes, I don't know, Brian. You're too smart. Let me put you on here. I said, the cost. And let's not even talk about the moral issue of, me being a Catholic and that kind of stuff. So just plus half of them die. I mean, you just put them on that thing and half of them are going to die anyway.
Right.
You put them on life sentence. I mean, these guys, most of them, you know what I'm saying? I mean, it's, plus I'm against it, that kind of thing. That's all I'm going to say. So, and I hate it when people say, and then, okay, now you guys talk about it. But let me tell you something. This is something that you should think about philosophically. As a Catholic, now that we have 3 Catholics on the Supreme Court, we might overturn death penalties because we never had it in the 70s. New York outlawed it, Illinois, even Tennessee, it was all law. You couldn't kill nobody. So that's why I'm not, what do you think about that?
Would you say traditionally you're conservative?
Right.
And you are
I'm a Goldwater conservative. Like
Goldwater conservative. So you're coming down against the death penalty for the reasons you said: cost, pro-life.
And I guess I'm going against my own grain, but I couldn't be there in the mob saying, hey, guy and stuff. I couldn't do it. I'd have to walk away like a Quaker or a Catholic or something. I'm sorry.
All right, Brian, thanks a lot. Thank you. And it's interesting. I mean, the conservative position for many years has been pro-life when it comes to abortion and pro-death penalty. And that, do you think there is a conflict there or not?
So I do, and especially when you're talking about the innocent people who have been tied up in the system. I mean, we have over 160 exonerees from death row, 4 people in Tennessee who have been wrongfully convicted and whose sentence has been overturned. And so that's very troubling to hear.
So it's possible the system may not get it right.
Yeah, and as a conservative, I'm certain the system doesn't get it right. I mean, I don't trust the government to get my mail right every time. I'm not going to trust the government to carry out an execution with 100% certainty every time.
Now, the last 2 people executed in Tennessee, you said Edmund Zagorski, there's no real doubt about his guilt. And Billy Ray Irick last month, there was no doubt about his guilt, and a terrible crime, both terrible crimes. What about when there's no doubt about their guilt?
I mean, they still have the appeal, the 30-year appeals, which is just tragic. And I think you heard some victims' family members saying 30 years, we could have had justice done 30 years ago if this case would have gone to something else. And I've heard that from not all victims' family members, but from lots of victims' family members who say, I don't want to be in front of the media for 30 years with this case. Let's go ahead and give them life without parole and let us not move on, because you will never move on from this, but let us get some closure through that.
Let's go to Sherry. Hello, Sherry. Sherry, are you there? Hi, Sherry, go right ahead.
Hi, good evening. My comment on the death penalty is this, that it is a failed attempt to deter actions, pathological actions by men mostly who were reared to be violent. And this is why it does not deter. So we still have to apply it because some of these crimes are so heinous that you've got to do something. But I think if they're going to use it, they should not let people sit on death row for 30 years. It should be more than 10 to 15 years if they're going to use it. Otherwise, the better thing to do is try to reform the criminal justice system so that maybe these people can be rehabilitated. And I know what are you going to do with a murderer, but they can be rehabilitated to some degree and maybe be useful, even if they have to still be locked up. Maybe they can be engaged in some kind of useful activity that will help society. But having people on death row for 30 and 40 years is just crazy. And
all right, well, let's talk about one of the issues you brought up, and I appreciate your call, Sherry. Yeah, she's talking about a deterrent.
Right.
And that's another thing we hear. This is a deterrent. It will prevent others from doing these terrible things. They see someone executed, they stop. They won't do what has been done in this case. What do you think about this notion of a deterrent?
So we've done some polling on, or we haven't, but there's been some polling on criminologists who the majority believe that this is not a deterrent. I mean, when you look at these crimes, a lot of these are crimes of passion. And then you also are looking at the fact that you can use these resources to go towards law enforcement. And you also look at these states who have done away with the death penalty, and their murder rates have actually gone down after getting rid of the death penalty because they've been better able to use their resources.
And she said it's against primarily men who have been raised to be violent. That's getting into their past history, some of the mitigating circumstances. Do you see that? Do you think that is something you've looked into this? Is that something you have seen, or is that not something you would agree with?
Well, what I've seen is that the overwhelming majority of people on death row could not afford their own attorney, and so you're looking at mainly people who are in the poverty levels who are sentenced to death row, because if you have the money to afford a good attorney, then they're most likely going to give you a different sentence.
Right. All right, we're going to take a break. Walter, David, Kaywood, others, stay on the line. If you want to call in, there's the number, 615-737-PLUS, 615-737-7587. Talking about the death penalty. What's your opinion? Take a break. Be back right after this.